This is the third and last section of the podcast, and we are going to continue with an exploration into the journey and experiences of clients who are new to this country. How can we be better prepared and able to provide support and services for migrant and refugee clients? Well, Janet talks about the migrant journey and her own experiences working with new arrivals. More importantly, Janet highlights what we as practitioners need to consider in becoming more culturally reflective. Have a listen.
The other broad area that we can prepare for is around what are some of the experiences people may have had and how can that influence them. And that's when we start getting into, information about have they had a refugee experience, have they had a migration experience, and that can have a significant impact on the functioning of the families.
What actually is that journey for many refugees coming into this country? In training, you mentioned a kind of a three-step home, transition, new home. Could you kind of paint a picture of that?
But I guess, in a general sense, and we use, as I said before, generalisations can be really helpful for guiding us. And then we need to go specific for the client that's in front of us. So we always have to take generalised information in the context of people will have their own specific journeys. But in a general sense, I think most families everywhere in the world, if you sit down with them, they'll be able to tell you this is the way we operated as a family in my home country. When it was all operating well, when there wasn't war and confusion, this is how we operated. These were our roles. These were our rules, and this is the way we related to children. And if people didn't obey those, then this is the system we had to step in. Whether that was a formal system, so, obviously I work in the area of child protection, so, we have a very formalised system in Australia where it's government. In most countries elsewhere, it's a very informal system. So to give an example, in a workshop that I ran with some new arrivals, we were talking about, what sort of forms of discipline do you use with children? And one of them said, we withhold food. And then we went on to talk about, what systems are there if you go too far? So I said, let's go back to the withholding food. Are you withholding food for a week? Are you withholding food for... And the person looked at me horrified and said, one meal? They go to bed without any food. I was like, right, okay, well, what would happen if someone withheld food for a week? And they said, the elders would come in, their leaders, the sister who lived next door, and they would take the child, talk to the parent, and until they were prepared to basically do it a different way, they would look after the child. And so it's actually, we're not that different when you get down to that below the iceberg stuff, that our worlds are that we want children to be safe, we want them to be happy, and most people, even though the line in the sand might be in a different place as to what's acceptable and when have you gone too far, and our systems of responding to that might be different, they might be informal or formal, those systems are there. But what can happen for families is, particularly with the refugee experience, they're often placed in a transition phase, and that can be, up to 10 years. Kids can be born and half-grown in a refugee camp. And, in those situations, parents are faced with heightened danger, so they're having to protect their children in situations where the danger is so much greater. Now, if you follow that logic, what would you do as a parent? You'd become more protective. Your strategies for ensuring that your children listen to you might become stronger and more heightened. That's understandable, I think. They're being protective parents. So, their values, their beliefs and attitudes behind those behaviours are that I can see there's a lot more danger that I need to protect my child from, and I need to use whatever I can at this point to make sure that my child listens to me and is kept safe. So there's a heightened sense of danger. There's heightened levels of anxiety because parents are having to be looking out for danger all the time. Then they come to Australia. Now, it's very complex, I think, in terms of how you assess and help families in Australia. But from my experience and talking to families, there's two with that highly protective behaviour. In Australia, that's often converted to overprotectiveness, which has a negative connotation to it, that parents might be seen as overprotective. If you take it in the context of their journey, it makes complete sense. It takes a while for a parent to readjust to a situation when they've been in highly dangerous situations for a long time. It takes a long time to be able to, relax.
And examples like, I don't want my child to go to school, or that hesitance about who are your friends and things like that. It makes perfect sense in that context.
Absolutely. And if we talk about the power of the media, people might see the media and see young people doing this, young people doing that, and there's stories about young people drinking too much and young people having sex and blah, blah, blah. That will scare parents who are already fearful. They've been highly protective parents. They've got their children through exceptional circumstances to keep them safe, and they want to continue keeping them safe. It makes sense. So, in terms of child protection, often what we talk about is, yes, what's above the water, we see what discipline is occurring. It might be that they're using what we would see as harmful physical discipline or things like that. But it's taken in the context, if you go beneath the water, often the intention of the parent will be that they're trying to protect their child from something. And that's not to say that then you walk away if the child is being physically harmed, but it helps you, the parent feels understood if you understand where they're coming from, and there's more chance of engagement and assisting that parent to adjust to a new situation. So we've got what we would consider as overprotectiveness, and that needs to, for some parents, it takes a while for that to come down, for them to feel safe and for them to feel like their children are safe. Then there's the other way, which is sometimes people get here and they go, thank goodness, I'm safe now. I've got my children to a safe place, I can relax. And, I worked with a case once where there was a woman from Sudan who had managed to get her 4 boys, all under the age of 10, to Australia, and she had walked for 3 months while she was pregnant, had a baby on the way to get to a camp in Kenya, had survived her time in Kenya in the camp as a single woman with 4 young boys, which is just exceptional in terms of her ability to protect her children, and got to Australia, and she sort of felt like she had made it. She'd got her boys to a safe place. Now, it wasn't long before I was visiting her place one day, and I walked into the room, and the little boy, the 2-year-old, was sitting on a stool screaming blue murder. She was looking stressed out of her brain, and I asked her, what's happened, what's going on? She said, I've got to wait till he stops screaming, and then I can put this stamp, and it was a little smiley face stamp, and then when he's done that, I stamp that piece of paper on the fridge. And I looked at her and said, who said you had to do that? And she said, this woman came to my house and she told me to do this. And I said, well, what woman was this? And I said, have you got a card? Because she didn't know who they were. And she had a business card, and I realised it was one of the service providers who was providing parenting classes to people who'd been reported to the Child Protection Unit. So I rang that person, and they told me a little bit more about how her 2 older boys had been found wandering out on the streets at 10 o'clock at night, and when the mother had been interviewed, she showed no concern, and so they had referred her for parenting lessons because she'd said that there was nothing that she could do about it. So I sat down and spoke to the client, and, it emerged that basically she was like, well, where is the danger? Like, this is a just country. I've brought my boys to a just country. So, I had to break it to her that there are some not so nice people in Australia, and that, it's not entirely safe. And so for the boys to be walking around at that time of night, it might not have been safe. So that was all news for her. And then I said, so, what can we do about it? And she said, well, it's not my role as a mother to discipline my boys. I'm here to nurture them. It would be their uncle that would do this job. And all through this, she was convinced that she was a bad mother, that everyone saw her as a bad mother. This is despite what we know about her journey of what a great mother she was. and is. And anyway, so in the end, to cut a long story short, the solution, the short-term solution, was that there was another gentleman in the community who had a daughter who was a single father, and he was having similar issues in terms of not knowing how to, respond to his daughter. And so they actually started to assist each other. So he would be the uncle for the boys and she would be the aunt for the girls. And whilst that was a short-term solution, because ultimately, you don't know where they're all going to end up living, bought the parenting agency some time to then work with her to adapt to her new role in Australia, because ultimately she was a single mum in Australia, and she was probably going to have to assume a new role where she was going to have to be more authoritative with her boys. But that was going to take time. You can't do that overnight if that's not the way you've been raised to be, and it takes a while to adjust. So in the short term, it was a great solution. And it acknowledged that, you can maintain some cultural frameworks. They're not all bad. That actually is a really great way of doing things when you've got your community around. But she hadn't seen the dangers, so she'd become underprotective in our opinion, And again, it's a negative assessment. But how can you make a decision around protecting your children if the dangers are unknown to you? And I think that's another area is where people who come to Australia from very different circumstances may not be able to see the dangers that are there. They haven't been raised in Australia to know that, people don't necessarily look out for your kids. It's not as communal here. So your next door neighbour may not watch out for your kids who you've left at home in the apartment, and the kids don't know them. And in fact, they could even be someone who could cause harm to your children. They may not have considered that if they're in a 3-storey apartment that could be dangerous, that they could fall over a balcony or burn themselves on the stove if they've never had electricity before. So there's a whole lot of work that caseworkers and providers can play a role in, which is helping people adapt and get the information they need so that they can make those informed decisions around when is my child able to supervise their siblings, rather than just saying you can't have your children supervising. It's about, every parent makes a decision about at what age the older sibling can stay at home, and they make it based on a whole lot of information that certainly new arrivals may not necessarily have in the first place.
That's the message that resonates with me is that lack of information and our assumptions, again, that as practitioners, it is our responsibility to provide information and share what it's like for newcomers, for new arrivals.
Well, I think one of the great quotes that this particular woman gave me at the time was after I'd sat down and talked to her about all of that, and we talked about what are the laws around child abuse and what is considered acceptable and what are the expectations of parents. She said, this has just been fantastic because up until now you've expected me to play the game, but no one gave me the rules, that you guys never talk about your own culture. You ask me all about mine, which, that's fine, but I need to know what you're thinking as well, and you need to be talking about that as well. And I think that's where our awareness comes in, that it's not only helpful for us to know what our cultural beliefs and values are, it's also important for us to talk about what they are in conversation, sharing with our clients, so that they can get a sense of what have they moved into. Where do our beliefs and values overlap? Where is their divergence? Is that divergence going to be an issue for them? So that they don't get to a point where, they have something like child protection turn up on their door when it could have been avoided, because it's quite traumatic. And if they've already had a series of traumatic events in their migration, it's the last thing you want, is for families to be re-traumatised by confrontational experiences, when it might have just been that they needed the information to know that, okay, well, I can't use that form of discipline here, and I need to equip myself with some new ones.
there's obvious systemic disadvantage faced by migrant and refugees in their new country. Could you provide some examples, just in case we're not aware of what those may be?
I guess it is. There's so many really. I mean, the obvious one is language, and I'm often surprised by the number of people who have not used interpreters in their work. Because certainly in the work that I did when I was working with newly arrived refugees, I used interpreters in the counselling setting, in the community development setting, in training settings. It was just a non-negotiable. And I think it's critical that agencies are budgeting for interpreting, because it's about a person's basic right to be able to express themselves. And it takes a long time to acquire a language. And emotional language is the last thing that you achieve, and that can sometimes take forever, decades, and some people may not ever be able to connect at that deep emotional level. And, most of you will be working with families, and when you're talking about families, that's emotional. It's the stuff that really gets people's passion and, their deep emotions activated. And when those deep emotions are activated, it's very hard to express yourself in English. So if you want to understand where a parent's beliefs and values are coming from, sometimes you need to use an interpreter. Even if their conversational English is fine, an interpreter can always be useful. So I think that's a critical thing that, as caseworkers, it's advertised in the waiting room that people can use interpreters. That, maybe some of your staff speak other languages than English, that you target your recruitment to the communities that you're working with. That it's obvious that this organisation understands that we're diverse and that we don't all speak English as a first language. So that's probably one of the main things. I mean, obviously with settlement, there's a huge amount of learning that people have to do when they come to Australia. Whatever area you work in is probably your priority that you want people to understand. I mean, certainly for us as people who work in child protection, we want people to understand child protection law. What we need to be aware is that they're also learning about how does the school system work, how does Centrelink work, how does the medical system work, how do the road rules work, how does renting work, they're having to absorb in a very short amount of time what we've learned over a lifetime and when we needed to learn it. So we've been able to take it in bite-sized pieces. So we need to be aware that people are taking on a lot, that we need to keep it on a needs-to-know basis, really, keep it simple and be open to having the conversation again and again. Because certainly with trauma experiences as well, it's hard to concentrate and hard to remember things. So acknowledging that that's normal. That it's okay, you can come back and I'll explain it again, letting people know that you're open and you understand the experience. I talked a little bit about that it's important that we're familiar, that we share about what are the norms in Australia, because there's not necessarily written documents about the laws, and what are the norms, and how do we relate, what do we think is polite, what do we think is rude, because people know when they've got heightened sense of awareness when they've offended someone, but they don't understand why, and they don't want to offend people. And it creates stress and anxiety for new arrivals when they know that they're offending people. So we need to be, I think, more open about what are the norms in Australia, and be the people that they can ask those questions of. And I think, there's certainly other things in relation to employment. I've certainly heard of people who change their names on their job applications because they know if they put their real name that they won't get the job. I've heard of people that when they turn up to the job and the person sees that they're black, the job is no longer available, and that happens to them over and over again, so it wasn't just a one-off coincidence. So, being conscious that there is a lot of prejudice and discrimination in Australia, that, as we discussed earlier, the media perpetuates a belief about who people are, and I think we are in a period where there's a loss of compassion for people who have experienced horrific things and need our compassion at this point in time, and that has been perpetuated by the media. And misinformation about what the experiences of those people are. So I think it is our responsibility as professionals to go out and find out what is the truth. When we see something on TV about how these people are coming just to get a better life and have an economic better future, we need to check out, well, what is the refugee process? If that was the case, is that true? How many people are getting refugee visas who are coming on boats? Because the majority of people have been able to fulfil all the aspects of the Refugee Convention, which means that they're not just coming for a better life. They are fleeing persecution. And as signatories to that UN Convention, and as a compassionate society and a caring society, I think those people need our compassion. Yet we are being manipulated, I think, to believe that they don't deserve our compassion. And, that's a significant thing for our clients. And so we need to, I guess, be conscious and support them through those disappointing experiences they will have, that they will meet people who are racist and have a lot of hate towards them. I know of a woman who, was waiting at a bus stop for a job interview. She was going to a job interview, was all beautifully dressed up, and a car drove past and threw eggs at her. And she wasn't able to turn up at the job interview because she was messy and ashamed and frightened. Now, you can imagine what the person at the other end, she didn't turn up for the job interview, unreliable, etc., etc. Yet that's her day-to-day life. That is what she experiences. And that was upsetting for me to know that that's what she experiences, but I need to know that's what she experiences. Because if I don't know, then I can't support her.
Yeah. Absolutely.
In adapting.
And on that note, we are concluding our very first podcast here at the NGO Learning Center. We'd like to sincerely thank Janet for taking the time out to talk to us about this really important subject. There's a number of resources that can be downloaded from the NGO Learning Center, and we invite you to share this information along with this podcast to your colleagues and your community. Thanks for listening, and until next time, have a great day.